Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev was 5'1" and looked about that wide, with a head like a peeled potato. He was born in 1894 in a tiny, abjectly poor peasant village near Ukraine. He went to work with his father in the farm fields after the most rudimentary education. After a year or two of school, I had learned to count up to 30, and my father decided that was enough of schooling, he would recall. He said that all I needed was to be able to count money, and I would never have more than 30 rubles to count anyway. Later, they moved to the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, where his father labored as a coal miner, and Nikita, at 14, started working in a factory, then with his father in the mines. After discovering politics and joining the Communist Party in the 1920s, the young Khrushchev maneuvered his way up the bureaucratic trellis to the Communist Party's Central Committee, running the capital region of Moscow. He would famously denounce Stalin after Stalin's death in 1953, but in the 1930s he worshipped him and craved his approval. So the former farm boy and part-time Ukrainian said nothing as Stalin drove the peasants onto state-run collective farms and confiscated their grain to the last kernel, causing the Holodomor, the famine in which millions of Ukrainians starved to death in 1932 and 33. Then, in Stalin's mad purges of that decade, Khrushchev dutifully rounded up tens of thousands of enemies of the people, including his own friends and colleagues, and handed them over to the meat grinder, as he put it, bombastically declaring that we must march across the corpses of the enemy toward the good of the people. Stalin posted him back to Ukraine in 1938, beginning his most despicable period yet. There was a strong separatist movement in Ukraine, not surprisingly, and Stalin, through Khrushchev, set out to smash it. By the time the German army poured into Ukraine in 1941, Khrushchev had imprisoned or deported some 750,000 Ukrainians, and at least 300,000 had died. It was so bad in Khrushchev's Ukraine that some Jews who had fled the Nazis in Poland asked to be sent back to Poland. As a political commissar with the Red Army during the war, Khrushchev played a minor role in the defense of Stalingrad, about which he exaggerated proudly for the rest of his life. He was back in Moscow by 1949, a member of Stalin's inner circle of thugs with Georgy Malenkov, Nikolai Bulganin, the loathsome Lavrenti Beria, and Vyacheslav Molotov. All members of the Presidium, Stalin's reorganized and renamed version of the policymaking Politburo, they toadied and capered around their withdrawn, melancholy, and deeply paranoid cheerless leader, while jockeying for position and backstabbing one another. Khrushchev was now Stalin's pet, as some of the others grumbled. Although he had improved his education a bit, he was no intellectual and considered by Stalin and the others a rustic and clown. Without doubt, a man of little culture, Molotov sniffed. This was how he survived the era. Intellectuals and city slickers made Stalin uneasy, and when Stalin was uneasy, he turned homicidal. Also, Khrushchev had the good grace to be significantly shorter than the sorely height-conscious leader, 5'1" to Stalin's 5'5" or 6. It was hard to tell exactly because he wore lifts, as the American photographer Margaret Burke White noticed when she got an audience with him in 1941. After seeing giant Big Brother images of him everywhere, she was startled by how short and weak-chested Stalin was. Harry Truman, who was not tall himself, called Stalin a little squirt. Through Stalin's last few years, Khrushchev and the others plotted and girded for the power struggle that would be inevitable when he died, which he did in 1953. He had a stroke. Earlier that year, he'd had the 9 most highly respected doctors in Moscow, 6 of them Jewish, arrested on conspiracy charges. The best treatment the remaining doctors could come up with was to apply leeches and leave him lying in his urine-soaked clothes. If ever a man was hoist with his own petard. Khrushchev took charge of the funeral arrangements. State film crews fanned out across the USSR to document the colossal hippodrome of crocodile tears he orchestrated around the nation. 200 million citizens in public rituals of mourning for the monster who had brutalized and massacred them for 30 years. As Khrushchev distanced himself from Stalin's legacy over the next couple of years, he thought better of doing anything with this footage. It sat in a vault until the filmmaker Sergei Loznitsa discovered it and edited it into the fascinating documentary State Funeral, released in 2019. At first, Khrushchev vied with Beria, Molotov, and Malenkov to succeed Stalin. Beria, as head of the NKVD, the secret police, later renamed the KGB and then the FSB, had files on everyone, making him the most dangerous adversary. Khrushchev and Malenkov, backed by Marshal Georgy Zhukov of the Red Army, had Beria arrested. Khrushchev would joke that he dropped a load in his pants, sentenced to treason and other high crimes, and shot, after which they prudently destroyed those files. Khrushchev was named first secretary of the Central Committee, ostensibly the top dog, though it would take him a few years to outmaneuver the others and emerge as capo di tutti capi. All were in over their heads. These were not great statesmen, political geniuses, or selfless servants of the people. As tyrants will, Stalin had surrounded himself with people who were no threat to his ego or his supremacy. These were men of no morals, a goon squad, henchmen, like a gaggle of mafia soldiers whose godfather had died and left them the keys to his dark empire. They didn't succeed Stalin so much as simply survive him. Most of Khrushchev's problems would be of the self-inflicted kind.